be in New York City with people online, as far off as Paris, France, Moscow, Russia, Chicago, Illinois, and I think California is going to be tuning in. Our sixth session of Future Historians. What session? How many? Eighth? All right. So we're getting to the end of this semester, and on our agenda today, Dan is going to lead us in creating the teams that are going to be working on the 5 remaining topics for this semester. Usually we go around and introduce ourselves, and I'd like to do that now, but instead of saying something about yourself, why don't we start off by doing a little brainstorming about our world. The world of right now, 2117, a capitalist world where we may still be struggling with social problems and above all with ecological problems, but we've created a different society. Say your name and where you are. Just give us one sentence off the top of the head, which Anya will type down and we'll put on the wiki. And then later we're going to have a whole session of brainstorming where we'll add on to each other's ideas and see what we can do just right off the top of the head. So let's start. Fred, why don't you start? You're at the far end of it.
Sorry, I just put my sleeper here. I'll stop this. Good morning. What I like about 2117 is the fact that there are almost always live musicians on every street corner as I walk around town.
Ben.
Okay.
Say who you are.
I'm Dan Hort. I'm here in New York City. And I actually think it's not as humorous and maybe not as nice, but I would like to think that the 2117 is going to be stable and safe for the human population on this planet. That would make me happy.
Well, say it in the present tense then. It is
stable and safe.
And what's it like to walk out on the streets?
Probably a little damp.
In 2117, we rescued public education from corporate overlords and put it back into the hands of people who really are concerned about educating kids.
And I'm a part of a child caring collective that's based in the neighborhood. So on a rotating basis, we get together and take care of all children on the block.
Nice.
And in my society, because there are many different self-organized societies in 2017, we have children who are learning on their own and doing work part-time and apprenticing part-time and participating in all kinds of projects. And the choice is left to them. Alexei in Moscow.
Well,
hello.
Can you hear us?
He heard us. He waved.
Alexei, speak.
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Yes. All right. Well, you're supposed to say your idea of what it's like right now in Moscow in 2117.
We are preparing for celebration of another jubilee of the revolution, the first revolution in 1917, and then the second revolution. So we are discussing with other historians how it became possible.
That's wonderful. Lola is next.
So in my society, we don't need any more incentives such as money to put people to work because they do just because they like to be useful in a society. So we have changed our idea of what motivates people, and not like infantilize everyone by thinking that we need incentives to actually do something and participate in society. So that's my society now.
Nice. Beautiful. Introduce yourself. Barry.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, so I'm Barry Feldman, and 2117 is where I'm centered right now. And in 2117, people have learned how to respect each other, particularly those they disagree with. And it's very important for them to respect each other. And it's really pretty amazing.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So, we have 2 or 3 things on the agenda today. 3 things on the agenda. All right. One is we're going to talk for about an hour about the readings and about the particularly the papers that are posted in the folder called Add to the Wiki, because we're functioning as a real, what do we call it, committee, editorial committee seminar to produce this volume of history for the youth of our society. Everything we do takes the form of an article or a passage or part of a chapter under a certain topic, and then we discuss it here, we discuss it online, and then when everybody is satisfied with it, or when the proposer is satisfied, she puts it online. So we've got several of those, plus a whole bunch of provocative articles, which the last of which was posted last night at 11 p.m. by Fred. Okay, now the second part of our meeting is going to be practical, because everybody is wonderful here, but we're always a week behind, like a dog running to catch up with its tail. So we're going to, Dan is going to lead us through the process of forming committees, not for 10 far off topics, but for the next 5, so that we'll know what we're doing until the end of this year. So that will be doing, and it'll stabilize our procedure. And then the last part, the fun part of our program, will be doing some brainstorming like we just did now. Not only coming up with wonderful ideas like music on every corner, but then really bullshitting, brainstorming, capping each other, adding something to that, so that we begin to get give it a little bit of depth. And so let's begin. Fred, you posted an article, a paper about violence and capitalism, correct? I mean, equality.
Yeah, that's one. So yes, first paper I posted was a review that James Scott wrote of a book called The Great Leveler, Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century. And just to summarize, basically pulling off the notes from our agenda for today, it was a review of what is really a deeply pessimistic account of the relationship between social and economic inequality and violence. According to Scott, the author implies that inequality in the economic sphere produces a political advantage that can perpetuate the position of the elite by means of taxes, business regulations, and labor laws. Inequality, in other words, leads to oligarchy, which in turn reproduces and exacerbates inequality, which is certainly a key feature of capitalism and has been from more or less from its inception. Scheidel also asserts that the highest rates of extraction by elites are found in conquest and colonial societies, where predation and extraction from a subjugated population are the very nature of the enterprise. So then the, you know, I don't have the full text of that article before me, and I kind of got caught off guard here a little bit. So I think we should hear from other people who have read that article what they thought of the ideas put forward in it, and if they have any comments or critiques to make. So I'm going to pass it back to the group if anybody has anything further to say about Scott's assessment of Scheidel's book. Just give me a second here to change the camera and the mic. Okay.
Anyone ready?
Yeah, I read it.
Oh, okay. I haven't read it. I read the summary. Sorry.
Okay, well, I agree with Scott, and it's nice. He's an author that I admire. Seeing Like a State is a great book that describes how all the projects thought of from above turn out to create disasters below, even though some of them are benevolent. And he talked about Brasilia, and he talked about Corbusier's ideas for this modern city and all kinds of stuff. What's the other book that he wrote that you like so much, Anya?
Oh, The Art of Not Being Governed.
Say it louder.
The Art of Not Being Governed,
Right.
where he analyzes communities in South Asia who historically would kind of distance themselves, run away in the mountains or geographically not very accessible areas. And he makes, he proposes his thesis that they were consciously evading the state to create more horizontal societies so that the state would not impose upon them.
So he's basically, I guess, an anarchist. I think he sometimes says he's an anarchist, yes?
Yeah, and he wrote the book, 2 Cheers to Anarchism.
What?
He wrote the book also, 2 Cheers to Anarchism.
2 cheers for anarchy, okay. Anyway, I agree this book is extremely pessimistic. He lists revolutions as one of the things that may end inequality, but not because people have demanded social justice, because revolutions are often produced by wars or lead to wars, and that the wars wipe out constant capital and variable capital, that is to say houses, machines, fields, and also the people that work them, so that this creates a flat platform, I guess you could call it creative destruction, that is part of the system, and it lets the system have another 30 years or another century of growth. This is not only, it's worse than pessimistic. I think far better would be to look at the ideas of Wallerstein, who sees world systems like capitalism as having cycles within them, and definitely disasters do decrease inequality, but also have a life cycle. And what we're living through now is clearly the end of the life cycle of capitalism, as several of the other authors represented say. And that opens, it's a time, according to Wallerstein, I hope you looked at his wonderful video there, it's a time of bifurcation for him. So that, yes, we can go back to something like slavery, feudalism, debt, servitude, and national, rabid nationalism and competition. That's certainly the Trump, Putin, who's the guy in Turkey?
Erdogan.
That's definitely the direction, along with the Saudis, that those people are moving. It could also be, after a real collapse, towards a better world.
But a living, breathing sort of example of this today here in this country is New Orleans, which is my hometown. So I'm deeply involved with what's going on there as the rise in violence post-Katrina. What happened when people left the city, most of the evacuees were African-American. And in the pre-Katrina years, the African-American community maintained sort of a thriving middle class by working in the service industry. restaurants, and they had for decades. For decades, they were it actually supported the African American community. And when 150,000 African Americans didn't return to New Orleans after Katrina, when New Orleans started to rebuild, then these jobs in restaurants and hotels were filled by other people. And now, and there's, I just read an article on income, the differences in income, between the African American community and how it's grown since Katrina. And the reason New Orleans actually will surpass New York, which is 40 times larger in sheer number of murders. But to me, it's this collapse of the African American middle class in New Orleans is the #1 reason. That and houses pre-Katrina that were affordable in the $50,000, $75,000 range now sell for $300,000 there. We said, what is to you the biggest difference? Because I just went to New Orleans 6 months ago, and I said it's become Americanized.
Right.
It's become more capitalistic than it ever was. It was very European in how the economy was spread. Yes, they had a class system that was divided amongst income, but it was very European in that people actually tended to get along. I found it growing up, moving to New York. New York was incredibly more diverse. Yeah, but also more segregated.
Right. Yes, no. Well, that's
so, I mean, I didn't really understand racism until I went to do work on a show in Boston. That was cool.
Boston is super segregated.
So, I think New Orleans serves as a real the rise in violence due to income disparity.
Well, I think the rise in violence also has to do with, like you said, mainly the destruction of traditional communities where people have human relations with each other, which may be simple commercial relationships, the local stores, the local restaurants, and so on and so forth, the schools, all of these community centers around, and the music particularly, around which people unite. I did a piece recently after the Charlottesville, attacked by the fascists there, and it turns out that the neighborhood where blacks had lived for generations and generations, which was a vital middle class and lower middle class neighborhood with real cohesion, was deliberately raised, and they were going to do something better for these people. But in fact, what they did is that they expelled them from the city. They left it barren with some things like that, just as they killed the Bronx up here, and just let the real estate prices go up. And then they put in institutions that don't pay taxes and stuff for the upper classes, the luxury gentrification. To be a consistent policy of capitalism, and it's part of capitalist history of enclosures. Drive the Irish off the land, and they end up in America as slaves first, and then as proletarians, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, the capitalism definitely just destroyed the city.
So that in the world that we live in today, like with Via Campesino that we were talking about, the Worldwide Peasants Organization, the resistance of, you could call them pre-capitalist or just, spontaneous, traditional communities at every level has become part of the vanguard, as setting an example of a possible better world that's based on human relations, and as resisting the mad drive of capitalism to enclose everything and turn it into a commodity.
What I was going to say is, in terms of this is sort of the inevitability of it creating an oligarchy, which then in turn kind of shuts down. One of the things that you're actually seeing, I have the sense it was somewhat true in New Orleans. For example, it wasn't so much that they had the money, but the French Quarter was amazingly left dry during Katrina. And of course, that was a more affluent area than some of the places that got whacked. Previously, I'm not going to remember the name of the hurricane in the 90s that hit Miami, also really took out.
Andrew.
Yeah, Andrew, thank you. Took out really bad neighborhoods. In the Caribbean, this last couple of months, what you're seeing is very wealthy homes were built with this in mind. And so the only thing left standing are these very wealthy people's homes. And suddenly everybody else is kind of without a place to be. And that in and of itself is going to, of course, push these people out. Suddenly the land has been cleared. You don't want to build it. You've got a neighbor who's got, a McMansion now built out of cinder block that has been built and designed to withstand this stuff, at least to the best of their abilities. And now all of their undesirable neighbors are simply sans home. And the next steps, which you're already beginning to hear people worrying about, it's only just happened, but there's no doubt that this is how it's going to go, is they're now going to clear out these neighborhoods and build more fancy homes that are more weather resistant, that are, of course, more expensive, and will then begin to gentrify, as it were, these islands. And it does, as I was trying to look it up in my notes here, in terms of Scott's paper, he does sort of talk about how the inevitability of being able to tax or being able to do, that these things are going to make it a fait accompli, that's how you're going to wind up with this situation. And frankly, I think it's true in New Orleans, it's true everywhere. New York has managed to avoid a lot of this for a variety of reasons, which we could talk about. But as you marginalize more people, you're going to have more violence. But that's really the deal.
And that, interestingly enough, is the cause from the beginning of capitalism of unemployment. Unemployment did not exist under slavery because they whipped everybody to make them work. Did not exist under feudalism because people had to not only work to support themselves but preside, give the church the tithe and the landlord his rent and so on. No, capitalism is the only society that creates unemployment, and that is why I believe Marx said that the basic rule of capitalism was the unemployed army. And this comes from separating out people from their communities and from their normal means of subsistence. And the Irish, for example, got kicked out of Ireland by the British, who turned their farms into places to profitably graze sheep and wool and so on, and beef for the beef eaters, while the Irish starved. When they were in New York, they had pigs. Pigs were always running in the streets town in the Irish neighborhood, and the Irish were looked down upon as horrible subhumans. And the do-gooders from uptown, for sanitation reasons, tried to get rid of the pigs, but the real reason was that gave them a little meat in their diets, and it was a good way of getting rid of whatever scraps they didn't eat themselves. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Well, I was just going to say what happened to post-Katrina and is going to happen. I don't know about Houston. I would love to know about Houston, but the only people, the city short-sighted people on when they condemned properties.
Right.
And because of the length of the time it took for them to get the flood insurance and all of this. By the way, private insurance didn't cover houses in Katrina because it was man-made when the levees broke.
God's gift.
Yeah, it wasn't the hurricane that flooded the city, it was a man-made incident. So
Which is a bullshit.
they short-sighted people on on their properties. They tore down, condemned, created derelict properties, and the developers moved in. And these are going to be the only people, regardless of the disaster. I thought about this with fires in California. If we do not support the communities, give them the chance to go back, then the developers are going to move in, and that's going to be it.
Well, that's what's happening in the Caribbean. And the other thing that's interesting is of course, which is also plays into that, is insurance in general. Is it's not a perfect example, but 9/11, for example, I forget the numbers of people that died when the towers went down, but there were some stock traders who were, of course, pretty wealthy to begin with. Their insurance paid them out millions, predicated on what their earnings were going to be over the years. And then you would have busboys, and their insurance paid out of what they were earning, so that the insurance is the fix, which again comes back to, I think, what Scott was writing about and several of the other people, but particularly, Scott, about the momentum of the situation where the fix is in. This is like now suddenly it's all set up, it's all funneling back the same way, because once, you know, he who has the money makes the rule, he makes the rule. I mean, again, we see it all over the place.
Alexei, actually.
Second. So yeah, I wanted to segue from that to the point that Wallerstein makes, both in the as well as in a book that is either the video is based on the book or the book is based on the video, but it's called Utopistics. It's a short little book that I've just been reading, and a couple of things about that is that one of the main reasons Wallerstein says we're now approaching the end of the 500-year cycle of capitalism is that the liberalism as the idea, which was the kind of the foremost ideology of capitalism for the last 150 years or more, is no longer effective, and that sense, in the sense of a something that gives the have-nots in the society, or the working people, or the the people on the short end of the inequality spectrum, something that gives them hope and confidence and expectation that things will get better for them, and that is simply in the last 10 or 15 years, and certainly has dissipated far more since 2008. Another point that he makes is that he talks about the question of free will versus determinism, and that determinism is usually predominant during periods of stability in a system. And that we are now at a moment when free will comes to the fore, and as he says, this will be a period in which the free will factors will be at its maximum, meaning that individual and collective action can have a greater impact on the future structuring of the world have in more normal times. That is, during the ongoing life of an historical system. So when an historical system is stable and viable, the perturbations in the system are kind of damped down. Things that people take initiatives to do to change it really don't have much of an impact. But when a system is moving into crisis, or is in crisis, and is unable to effectively reproduce itself, small changes that are implemented by groups acting willfully in a direction to change the system can have a much bigger. I think it should give us some hope for, as future historians, some expectations that things can be changed in a positive direction by initially smaller groups of people taking initiatives and setting examples and being audacious.
I would like to bring Alexei in Moscow into this conversation, because in the last 20 years, Russia has undergone basically what the peoples of Europe underwent over a long period under capitalism. That is to say, the enclosure of all the public goods, the transformation of the society, in which, at least on paper, the working people were the owners of the means of production, into a kind of neo-capitalism that resembles very much what Alexei to comment on.
Yes, Richard, I'm sorry I can hardly hear people speaking because of very bad condition of connection. I can only hear you now. So if we're talking about last decades of capitalism in Russia, I would say that it was not something new for our country, because actually we never lived under another system from the beginning of 20th century. And we just had in the late 80s and early 90s the changing of forms of the capitalist system. Before we had a kind of bureaucratic state capitalist system, and then we had a transition to a new private corporate capitalist system. And under Putin, we again had a transition to a kind of state capitalism, but in new form, not in the form of the Soviet Union times, but a new form. And now the economy is basically controlled by state corporations, with corporations which are property actually of a circle of oligarchs around Putin. So this is a new kind of society. It's not a neoliberal society. It's not a bureaucratic state capitalist society. Inside, it's something different. And this can be understood also in the context of what Wolfgang Strick described in his article, which you recommended for reading for this session. He wrote that in contemporary times, countries with authoritarian political systems are more prepared to face the so-called challenges of globalization. And this means that authoritarian political system becomes more and more popular among capitalist classes around the world. And what we see in Turkey, what we see in United States, and what we see in developed form in Russia or China or Iran, another example. This is the reflection of the same tendency of the contemporary capitalism, a tendency of political anti-democratic regression to a kind of new authoritarianism. And the crisis of international neoliberalism can produce, and is producing now, the kind of reverse to state capitalism. And this tendency can be seen in future. So this produces a new contradiction in social life around the world. And this can lead to aggravating of crisis of capitalism. But another question is if there any kind of alternative to capitalism, and if capitalism is in itself is already prepared to be transgressed or negated by something new. And Wolfgang Strick argues that there is a crisis of capitalism, but there is no way out of this crisis because there is no some alternative in the world. And I would suggest that I think that we have to go back to Marx, to his analysis of the fates of social systems, that no social system can perish until it stops to develop productive forces. And in spite of all crisis of capitalism, now we still witness the development of productive forces. So the crisis of capitalism does not mean the terminal phase of this crisis. The terminal phase can be in future, and what is very important is to have some kind of alternative to develop. And I can go on this topic, but I prefer to stop now.
Yeah. Fred.
Yes, yeah, we can hear you. Yeah, Alexei, I would just add to that, and maybe a slightly different viewpoint in that while the productive forces are continuing to develop in some ways, what is really developing are the destructive forces alongside that. Something we talked about a lot in the last 2 weeks when we were discussing catastrophes. I also found another passage in Wallerstein's book about the mafia principle, which sounds very much like what you're experiencing in Russia. Mafias have always been an intrinsic element of the modern world system. They seek to obtain substantial profits either by evading legal constraints and taxes or by extorting protection costs, and who are ready to use private force, extensive bribery, and corruption of the formal state processes to ensure the viability of this mode of accumulation of capital. In ordinary times, strong states usually constrain these robber barons and mafiosi capitalists, but the situation has changed today. The bureaucracies and politicians of weak states, and even of some of the stronger ones, are becoming even weaker and losing popular legitimation and consequently some popular control, and therefore have tended in many cases to merge their interests with those of extra-state mafias. In some cases, it may not be useful or meaningful to distinguish the two groups. Did Barry want to say something on this? Barry tells us he has to leave at about noon, so I thought we'd give him a chance to chime in.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I have to go. It's been a very stimulating conversation. I have to take my daughter to her orchestra practice. But yeah, let me try to statement as possible that addresses the main points that you brought up. I think what we can say about today is that the mode of production of the Marxist kind of framework is changing under our feet. That the information technology revolution over a horizon of, say, 60 years, like 20 years, that is as in the internet phase. And then over the last 10 years is as in the what I call the blockchain phase. And I think a lot of us can see that the internet has really reorganized the global system very significantly. And to try to be brief, I would just point out Google as an example of a new type of capitalist structure that's profoundly different than anything that has come before. And Google offers its nominal product for free. You know, there is no price to doing a search on Google. On the other hand, your search turns into information that is useful for the capitalist system. It becomes a product in itself that's sold to somebody else or used by Google. So that's one dynamic that, you know, we really have to get a grip on, because that's really changing changing the way the world works. This is called platform capitalism in the economic research literature. And then the other dimension of the blockchain, you've got Bitcoin on the one hand, this is digital cash that potentially makes the central bank obsolete. And then you have the blockchain, which is much more profound, actually. Blockchain is like the data structure that makes the Bitcoin possible. And blockchain has the potential to disintermediate, as they say, sort of take apart some of the biggest businesses going. And Amazon is maybe the best example of that. With blockchain, it's not clear that you need to have an Amazon. And in fact, the dynamic of blockchain might be to disassemble a company like Amazon in the future. So this is all capitalism. And, you know, so capitalism is in crisis. Capitalism is changing. And as we're talking about, these times of change bring times of opportunity. And so, you know, and that brings back the disaster type of discussions that we're having last week and 2 weeks ago. And Sam Fassbender mentioned Caliban and the Witch in response to some things that Richard had brought up about how the plagues in the Middle Ages altered the balance of power between workers and you know, the feudal powers and the commercial and the mercantilists of that time. And something similar is possible to happen today. So the thing I see is that's really important to understand what is happening under our feet. So when we talk about capitalism, we want to think about what capitalism is becoming, not what it's been. And, you know, to understand that there might be some profound changes in the way that capitalism is working. And then to try to wrap this up, I don't want to go on for too long, but, you know, we have this huge, huge problem that everybody is vaguely aware of, but nobody really has a comprehensive idea of how to address, which is the whole artificial intelligence dimension of things, and the fact that the economy as we know it is going to need less and less workers to produce products. And so therefore, there could either be a tremendous amount of unemployment, something we know about, or there's potential to rework the economy somehow so that there is employment. And there's a lot of discussion about this right now and how to do it. And so I think the sort of more, if you will, more liberal or more revolutionary, and also slightly different axis of things, more practical and less practical, ways to try to address this. This is really a very fascinating time that we're living through right now. And actually, there's one paper that I'll send around that someone pointed out to me recently that addresses some of these topics. It's a paper by this Italian woman, Atsari, I think is her name, and it's about the blockchain. So I will post that when I have the opportunity, hopefully sometime today. So thank you. Sorry to run on for a while.
We're having some audio problems. Say again, Richard?
I said I'd like to hear from Lola on this point, and then we'll move on, because I want to briefly summarize the paper I posted.
So it's can you hear me? I just wanted to say that I'm not a specialist like all of you, but I couldn't hear everything that Alexa said, but I agree when he says that people, at least in people's mind, it's very hard for people to conceptualize an alternative to capitalism. And I think that a huge effort should be made by social movement activists to show people to identify capitalism for what it is, and to try to imagine what else could be. Because people think that it's always been like that, so what else, how can it be any different? And the problem is that maybe of any system, but with capitalism, it makes people think that it shapes a certain image of what human nature is. And in our minds, capitalism creates, it means that it's not like the system that creates human nature. It would be that human nature creates capitalism. And I think it's the reverse. But people think that, no, we are competitive, we need to be stronger than everyone else. And we have these ideas that are fostered by capitalism and are maintained because they serve the system. And I think that we would need to educate people to make them see capitalism as less inevitable as they seem to think of it right now. And so, yeah, it would be good to educate people to imagine alternatives and to rethink what they think is human nature, and that's what we think is, as always has been right now, and what we think is natural and legitimate and comes from genes, like to identify the strong influence of the environment and the system on who we are and how we act in our lives, in our social relationships, and even how we think about others. And I think that if you create such possibilities, it would help people, well, think that, okay, this is one system that we have and we've had it for a long time, but it's not like the end. It doesn't have to be this way. And this lack of creativity when it comes to thinking about the system, I think it's one thing that we have to overcome because in some intellectuals and activists, they manage to do that, but I think it's not what we learn. We're so entangled in the system that we need to have some perspective on it, and it's a very hard thing to do. And it would question many of our thoughts, of our thinkings, of things that we hold as true. So it's a very hard thing for people to do. And we know in psychology that uncertainty can be pretty frightening for people. So we try to find strategies to overcome the uncertainty that we see in the world. And seeing the system as legitimate and inevitable is a way of reducing this uncertainty. But if we can present an alternative that seems plausible and even better, and definitely that would not create so much uncertainty, I think people would maybe engage in more thinking towards those alternatives. I don't know if that makes sense, what I've been saying.
Well, it's so interesting. I'm going to try to synthesize everything that everybody just said here, because I think it's actually fascinating. And what it really comes back to, and I just love the idea, it's so accurate, the idea that somehow capitalism reflects human nature as opposed to capitalism driving what we perceive as being human nature is, spot on, and is really a great, very clear, concise verbalization of it. One of the things that I'm hearing that Barry was just saying, but I actually was thinking about it as I was listening to Alexi, and it actually is something that I was talking to someone about this week, is capitalism is much more fluid, and it maneuvers way quicker than socialism does, frankly, and groups like this. That what I find most interesting, and have been sort of watching it, and I almost don't want to say it's fascinating because it's sick, but what Alexi is talking about what's going on in Russia is a very interesting morphing of what is becoming of what capital can be. And although it's not quite the same in the US, you're really seeing it, is that in Russia, you had what was a state run, and so you had military, government officials. When that shifted, suddenly they became legitimate businessmen, but it was the same people. And now they have moved themselves into this oligarchy system, if I'm understanding what Alexi was saying, which is really, as I say, fascinating. It's scary, but nevertheless, you see, we see them here. A couple of years ago, there was a cruise ship in the harbor here, and it was either a very large private yacht or a very small cruise ship. And when we Googled it, it turned out it was some Russian oligarchist who, former KGB guy, former military, that now owns all the lumber in Eastern Europe and is essentially a billionaire. And it was like a James Bond type of boat. It had like 3 helicopter pads. It was really quite elaborate. And you begin to wonder, what is this guy thinking? He's planning on surviving nuclear bombs. He's planning on surviving being, somebody shooting at him. Very, very elaborate. And this is a different kind of capitalist. And the truth is I do think that here in the US, when you look at someone like Donald Trump, they also are beginning to move into that area where they are no longer just industrialists. They are no longer that they are, they're more of a hybrid. And so one of the things that I'm sort of maybe not articulating as clearly as I would like to, but I think Barry just said it, and it's absolutely true, is that we have to creatively begin to think about how we're responding to these things. And that that capitalism has done a very good job, frankly, of continuing to move forward, of continuing to be a moving target, of continuing to maneuver sensibly towards the future that it wants to have. And I actually think present company not included, that we are, as socialists and progressive left people, that we are not maneuvering as flexibly, that we are much more caught up in, like I had this thing I was talking to someone about. I actually think that the notion of labor needs to begin to include the fact of consumption, that the fact is that most labor is being bunked and being moved off. The one thing that's driving all of this is consumption. And that if you were able to get your labor, which is consumers, to begin to view themselves in that capacity, then you might have a new weapon to fight against this stuff with, because clearly, what are they trying to do other than, continue to sell product and move forward? So I guess, as I say, what I think that this group has to do, and I do think this is a great discussion for it, is to begin to, whether it's out of the box, in the box, creatively begin to think about how we can offer and put forward new and more salient ideas about how to offer a better solution. And I do hear everybody saying that. And I think it's, as you say, I think it's really, really great, actually. But again, just to put the finger on it, is it's not your daddy's socialism, it's communism.
Well, one of when Pope Francis came out and spoke against capitalism,
Right.
my friends who were from New Orleans, I went to a Catholic high school, my Catholic friends were outraged that the Pope would say this, that he is naive and he doesn't understand business and all of this stuff. And that's just such the great marketing job that capitalism does, is that the leader of their church, supposedly, is a heretic.
But interestingly enough, of course, the irony is, of course, he very well understands marketing as he's trying to garner more audience, as it were, and create more customers for his brand. And he sensibly has come to the conclusion that that's a better, and I think incidentally, they, despite themselves, put him in because they were hoping to bring in a guy that was more accessible, that was more user-friendly, and would reach broader audiences.
Oh, yeah, beware of the Jesuits.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, just a couple of points. So in terms of human nature, as Lola just discussed, I've listened to a video, a lecture by Wolfgang Strick. I don't know if he talks about that in his paper that we read for today, but he says, he discusses how the habits of people had to be changed when the capitalist system just started developing that. And he uses the terms, like there were two different ways of life: subsistence versus maximization. People in the subsistence know that they only needed what they needed to survive. And once they had enough, they stopped working. But then they had to change. Their habits had to change. Their attitudes, their desires had to change so that they would keep working to accumulate, so that they wouldn't go home and have fun and relax after they had enough food or shelter, and that's it. And the second point is, but how do we change our visions of how world could be? So an empirical example, so in Argentina, I just read the book by Marina Citrin, Horizontalism or Everyday Revolution. So when there was the crisis in 2001 in Argentina, people started occupying factories spontaneously, and they recuperated them. So they kept producing, they kept operating them, and through struggles, they changed their attitudes, they changed social relations among them. And Marina Citrin, as a sociologist, she interviews them, and in order to show how they suddenly came into realization, oh, well, look how we lived before, and well, how suddenly came to realize that we have to care of each other, that that we have to fight against oppression, and that through fighting, through struggle, through this cooperation, we can actually achieve better relationships with each other. So, but even without having a concrete alternative in front of them, somehow spontaneously they came to realize this alternative, whether successful or not in the end, but still there was this process of changing their attitudes and their visions.
I think this has been a really fruitful discussion, and I want particularly to thank Lola, because I think you really defined better than anybody the purpose of this group, which is, yes, a seminar, a discussion group, a research organization, but most of all, a task force to search through the past and the present to find what elements we can project that are plausible, imaginable, realistic for a better world. And I think that that is the most powerful thing that we can do at this moment. Because as Naomi Klein has said for all of us, no is not enough. And people never do anything just in the negative way to protect themselves. Revolutions happen when people have a picture of what could be better. And I think nobody else is really working on this. And certainly no one is doing it collectively the way we are. And by the way, just to make it clear, I'm the only academic present here, and Alexei, in Russia. And I've been retired for a long time. And I was just a French teacher and a translator. So I like to use a professional historian, at least. We are just people from many different walks of life.
Sam.
What?
Sam is official.
Yeah,
Right.
he just showed up too.
Oh, and he just showed up. Okay, welcome, Sam. So I would like to, I've got 2 papers in the box, and I don't want to take up too much time. But I want to take the second one first, the one that I published on the wiki, okay? And the one that is called post-capitalism, because I want to stick with the optimism that Lola and others have injected into this conversation. I also want to tell you how easy it is, okay? I didn't write it on the wiki, I opened the doc so that I could make lots of mistakes and just write whatever went through my head, okay? And I just started with the first idea that came into my head, caring and sharing. Because Jenny's mother is a kindergarten teacher and we were always part of her class and everything. And that is the basic rule. One of my favorite books is everything I know, I learned, everything positive I know, I learned in kindergarten. So I just started out with this idea of caring and sharing, which just breaks the mold of it's socialism, it's state planning, it's efficient, it's this, that, and the other thing. Nobody really gets erotically aroused by ideas like that. But caring and sharing, yes. And sharing means being creative and bringing out your life and thinking of things and imagining things and making things. And caring, obviously, is everything about solidarity and love. So I think caring and sharing pretty much covers the ground. And then I elaborated in terms of political economy, borrowing mostly from Marx's critique of the Gotha program. But and then at the last moment when I finished it, I said, well, who is here talking to who? And I realized, okay, we're aiming this anthology of topic essays on the 100th anniversary at teenagers, 17-year-olds in 2017, right? So I imagined that this was an address by a teacher to the graduating class of some trade school or whatever it was. And I gave her a name, which was the name of a teacher I once knew. And suddenly the thing became very, very real to me. So what I foresaw in this future society is basically people getting paid money. Well, then what I proposed was a whole bunch of different societies. And I sort of said what they were. And I said, well, in this particular one, we have money, but it's money that is stripped of its capitalist usage and where everybody contributes a certain effort, which can be measured by the hour and also by how hard it is. Like somebody that's breaking up rocks obviously is spending harder than someone that is sitting in an office. And so I just developed those ideas. Now I made a mistake. I used this wonderful idea of de-interest, that they have in local currencies, spend it or lose it. So that there's no way anyone wants to accumulate capital because you've got negative interest. You've got a year to spend whatever it is you've earned. And if you don't, it's, let's say 5% a year, it diminishes. But of course, I forgot that we would need savings taken out of people's efforts for a general public fund. And so that would have to be a kind of a caisse commune. I don't know how to say it in English. A community chest, exactly. A community chest that everybody contributes, like taxes and so on. And that's money there to finance startups and public works and all kinds of things like that. So I don't think I was too far off with it, but like everything we do on a wiki, we can always change it. So the lesson of that is just put out there what you want to see, and then see if you can figure out how it might work. And don't be scared, because we can always change it. Now, I'd also like we're going to come back to that. We're going to do brainstorming, but I tried to get ahead of the game to give an example of how easy it is and what you can do. Just starting from a simple idea, like music on every street corner. Or the paper that I wrote, that I've been working on for quite a while, is called Capitalism's Final Crisis. Now, we've gone over the Wallerstein argument, that it's a 500-year cycle, and so on. And I think we can see all around us, just instinctively, that this is a system which is destroying itself and destroying the world. And here again, here in one case is where I disagree with Alexei. And we've been having this discussion among classical Marxists.
He's not there.
He's not there?
No, he's popping in and out, it seems.
All right.
He'll be back.
Alexei, can you hear me? Oh, well, can he answer?
He's not there. I'm saying it. Wait, now there he is. Yay!
So the video is.
He's not agreeing with you.
Alexei, I agree with you 100%, and so does Lola, that what we need to do is present a vision of a different world. And backing up what Lola said about human nature, and what you said about how it gets transformed in the process of struggle. Okay. I'd like to cite as an example the Soviet Union, because my experience and reading says that indeed the way people treated each other in certain respects and the sense of community that existed, despite Stalinism and despite the purges and everything else, the Bolshevik Revolution did leave a legacy, a moral capital, that of a sense of all of us pulling together. And I was wondering if Alexei could maybe draw on that and project it into what the future might be in the post-Putin, post-capitalist Russia. But now, Alexei, the point that we've argued about for years, which is you say that capitalism is still able to expand and that growth rates are continuing. Empirically, that is apparently contradicted by 2 or 3 of the authors whom we read for this class. And I make the argument that financialization is a simple way of saying that when capitalists, investors, can't make money by hiring labor, that is to say, variable capital, and buying machines and raw materials, that is to say, constant capital, putting them to productive use, or even to non-productive but saleable use. And there is a difference, like making weapons that we're forced to pay for, even though the only way we can sue them is by dying. Those are the only industries that are really growth industries. But in terms of consumer goods and even most capital goods, financialization means that the owners of capitalism are afraid to put money in and hire workers. And that therefore they are speculating and they're making lots and lots of money. But speculative bubbles, we know all about them. They rise up and then they crash. It's Amway on a planetary basis. And it seems to me fairly obvious, that's the meat of my argument, that we've had one crisis after another. 2008 was the biggest one. They've done nothing to fix the holes in the bubble, and that the next one is going to be much, much bigger and much, much more planetary. Okay, now, what is my argument? You see that I'm wearing my favorite button that Jenny gave me. It's a picture of Karl Marx, and it says, I told you this would happen. Well, it's very funny and I love it, but my paper cuts that in half because everybody believed that what Marx wrote about capitalism's contradictions and inevitable, he never used the word inevitable. That's the whole point. The generations of socialists and Marxists believed that capitalism's collapse was just around the corner. And Engels in particular, no one could be closer to Marx than Engels. Every time there was a big flutter in the London Stock Exchange, you know, he was ready to get on his horse and go out and fight for the revolution like it was 1848 all over again. But that didn't happen. What happened is that capitalism had its crises, but the crises were funneled into wars and massacres, and it was clear that capitalism was decadent and overripe and no longer progressive and productive, but it also wasn't collapsing. Why? All right, here, Alexei, I agree 99% with you, okay? You are perfectly right in saying that capitalism won't be ready to collapse until, from being confined to Europe or Europe and America, it has become a full-fledged world system in which everything or practically everything has been commodified. And that is because the tendency for the rate of profit to decline, which is endemic, okay, because of labor's contradictory relationship with capital, or capital's contradictory relationship with labor, which is a bad marriage. You can't, it's like a spouse that you can't live with and you can't live without, because labor is still the source of value. And even if we have machines that print out commodities, the machines have to be built by somebody, and the raw materials, which are mainly petroleum products, have to be fed into the machine that then cuts them out like cookie cutters and puts them in the market. So this is nothing particularly new. What's new is that the rate at which the amount of labor contained in commodities is declining, thanks to automation, which is the byproduct of internet technology, to some extent, computer technology. Yes, but this has been secular. So that the world's proletariat today is numerically larger than it's ever been, but as a proportion to the population, declining, which means a decline in the number of salaried people who can buy the products. So this has been the tendency in capitalism from the beginning. This is what causes or provokes periodic crashes and crises, but capitalism has always been able to overcome them. But now, and one of the ways it's overcome them is imperialism. That is to say, going to pre-capitalist areas and looting them. And that is partly what has been done to the former communist, so-called communist world. The second world has been enclosed and extracted by the world system of which it was always a part. But now the barriers of collectivization have been removed, and it's moved backwards. So what I am saying is this: the reason that Engels was wrong to get on his horse in 1883, when there was a crisis on the London Stock Exchange, is that capitalism had not fully developed. But here, Alexei, I think that we can see that it can't go much further. What capitalism is doing now is regressive. It has become extractive through two methods. One is stealing and enclosing, like it did in 1492, everything that's left of forests, of lands, of raw materials on the one hand, and it's now using debt increasingly in order to squeeze money out of the poor and producing greater and greater unemployment, even though there's a huge amount of production. A lot of it is destructive or useless. But this is the product of a sick system. It is not producing values that are sustainable. And so I say that we are now in, for all of these reasons, in capitalism's terminal crisis. Now, obviously, when you say a patient is terminal, it means that you expect that patient to die in the near future. But of course, you can't really predict that way. You know, it could last a long time. And I see dying capitalism like a wild beast that is bleeding and it is dying like some sort of dragon that has been pierced, but that tail is still lashing. And the lashing of the tail of this dying dragon could very well wipe out the humanity. It could just knock all of us and all the other living things like the plants and the animals.
Maybe Dr. Kevorkian?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Dr. Kevorkian?
Well, he's the one that's for suicide.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, I love Dr. Kevorkian, but let's not get personal. I'm ready to go on 78.
No, he's talking about good gambling.
In any case, don't get me on this subject. Let's get to the subject of capitalism's terminal crisis. Obviously, that's unscientific, but not from the point of our 2017. And that's why this seminar is unique. Looking backwards, if we survived, and we really are, here in 2117, it can only be because capitalism did collapse and that it was replaced by something based on caring and sharing. So to that extent, we have to take as an assumption, Alexei, even though it may not be entirely scientific, that capitalism has developed fully and internationally. And that now and only now can we talk about a worldwide transformation. Next week's topic is internationalism, where I think we will be able to show to each other and to our readings that revolutions and changes can only be permanent and effective when they take place on a planetary scale. And that was the perspective as early as 1848, when people began to see working people of all nations unite. It must be on that basis. As long as capitalism is the presiding world system, and by capitalism is always linked with the world state system, not with one or another national state, but with a state system, because we can't have societies based on human autonomy when they are societies based on heavily armed national states that are dominating the world. So we're talking about a total world change. And that, I think, is the only way forward and the only way that we can generate a vision of the future that will be, and this is our basic baseline for this seminar, plausible, possible, however bad the odds may seem at this time. Okay, I'd like to stop there. Alexei can answer me and the rest of you as well.
Alexei, did you wish to?
I don't know whether we heard.
Richard,
Did you hear me?
Yes, can I answer?
Yes. Well, I just said it's now your turn to answer, but I'm wondering if you heard me.
Yes.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
Yes, I can hear you, but not other people.
Oh, you can't hear the people that are online in other, like Paris?
Yes, very bad. But you, I understand well.
All right, well, why don't you stay online after 1 o'clock and we'll try to figure that out.
Okay, we already had conversation with Fred about that. I think we found the only one possible solution.
Well, it needs improvement, so, but right now, go ahead.
Okay. So I agree with Richard's description of capitalist problems, but I think that what he described is the nature of capitalism itself. And capitalism forever produced crisis, inequality, and unemployment, and so on. And we can discuss if now something qualitatively changed. I don't think so. I think that this was a feature of this basic feature of the system forever, actually. I remember a joke about Trotskyists. When Leon Trotsky wrote in the late 30s his transitional program, and he stated quite unequivocally that the productive forces of humanity stagnate now. And then the Trotskyists of the later decades, they reproduced this dictum of Trotsky, and they wrote their words about the stagnation of capitalism. First on typewriters, then on big computers, finally on laptops, and so on and so forth. But for them, productive forces stagnate. I think this is empirically not sustainable conception. I don't speak now about iPhone number 10, but I can speak about 3D printers and robotization, automation. This is the development of capitalism, the development of productive forces under capitalism, which produces what Marx and classical Marxists call the objective preconditions for transgression of capitalism. When we have robots and machines making tools, but not people, this is a problem in the capitalist society because it generates unemployment. And this can't be solved if capitalism still retains the same form and it's not transformed. And for this, because of this, we now have not only in academic circles, but in political circles, discussions of such things as basic income. And for example, in France, the recent elections, this was the basic idea of Benoît program. Basic income is a kind of anti-capitalist measure. And this is also discussed not only in most advanced developed countries, but even in Africa and Asia and so on. These kind of things like basic income, this can be a part of the movement to transition from capitalism to something new. But we can't, from my point of view, look at the future transition from capitalism as a kind of catastrophe, as a kind of an act. It's not an act. It can be only a process. And that's, we need to go back to Marx's conception of transition, of transitional form of society, which does not decree to abandon capitalism by a law, but which tries to transform the system from capitalism to something post-capitalism. Yes, it's a transitional conception which can be elaborated and can be discussed. Not just decree to end capitalism, but to find a way to make something new which can be more productive than capitalism. To beat capitalism in competition, not to abandon it. That's the point of view which I think we should develop from. And what revolutionary reforms, so to say, can be proposed now? Not just to close one chapter of history and open another one, but how to get from there to here. That's the most important point, I think.
Right. Absolutely. I agree.
I have a quick question. But in the U.S., especially after 9/11 and then after the financial collapse, when the banks and financial companies freed up credit and built essentially economic slavery through the accumulation of debt, and we sit here with 12 trillion in debt, in personal debt. it seems logical that the only thing that would happen, especially as our government shifts to the more austerity-minded non-support of people, that the only thing left eventually will be some sort of collectivism. But again, and this goes back to, I think, Lola's a concept of changing minds. How, the question is, how do you teach people that collectivism is not bad? I mean, out of necessity, barter and collectivism seems like it would be a solution. But it seems that you have to fight the negativity of it.
Well, I think, as Mary, it's being said,
I'm sorry. Can I see the mic?
Yeah, sure.
I see where you're going, Richard, but Dickie, I would just caution against using the word collectivism, right, which I think is a term that the right wing developed as a kind of a slander against socialist ideas. And so I think we'd be better off speaking in terms of cooperation and the caring and sharing notion that Richard raised. And I think, Marx definitely postulated that getting rid of capitalism would create the conditions for the full and free development of all individuals, and a flourishing of individualism in addition to a flourishing of cooperation and sharing and caring. So I don't disagree with the main point you were making, but I think we should refine our language a little. Sam, I think had something to say that might be relevant to this particular point, because he was online, at least in the chat, had some questions about the notion of moral capital and the persistence of solidarity and cooperation in the Soviet Union. Sam, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can I be heard?
We hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you.
Okay. What's moral capital? What's moral capital? Oh, am I still audible?
Yeah, you're audible. What are you asking?
What's moral capital?
What's moral capital?
What's moral capital? Yeah, I think it's I don't like these terms moral capital and social capital, because they kind of obscure what capital is supposed to be. Capital is a way of, of using money to make more money. So what's moral capital? That's my question.
Okay. All right. I was the one that used that phrase, and it's a quote from Victor Serge, who explained in part the enthusiasm and the courage of the Russians in resisting Hitler during World War II. And in fact, explained in part that many people in Soviet Russia participated willingly in industrialization and so on by what he called the moral capital of the Bolshevik Revolution. That is to say, that the legitimacy of the idea of a Soviet system that the common people would have a vested interest in, that was still active 20 years after the revolution, even though the revolution had been hijacked by Stalinist bureaucrats. And today, newspapers talk about the political capital of a certain candidate, right? That Obama didn't want to use up his political capital at saving the environment or doing anything for the blacks, for example. So, I was just using it as a catchphrase, and I'll happily withdraw it and I agree with you that, of course, it's a contradiction in terms.
Okay, that's all.
Is that what I was going to say, which is, again, and I apologize, I'm just going to be the harper on this stuff.
That's all. Oh, am I?
I like very much where this last little bit has gone, because even if it becomes a little bit of parsing words, I really think it's important, and I think it's what the tenor of what we're being talked about here, is you can't fight a new enemy with the old rules. And although some of the things that we're dealing with are long-term systemic issues, there's definitely, it's something that Alexei, I think, really hammered home here, and Barry that then also kind of hit on it, is that capitalism, as it were, it's different. It's different than what Karl Marx was writing about. It's a growing organic. It's not at all different, is what you're saying?
Not that different.
All right. Well, in some ways it isn't. In some ways it isn't. And when you suggest, by the way, which I agree with, that we should maybe steer clear of words that seem like the old words that then have been co-opted to mean something that maybe they didn't, I think it would be a good endeavor for this group to try to move into an area where we are trying to use definitions differently, maybe calling things different kinds of things. The idea of caring and sharing is being, I think that those are if nothing else, they're good PR things, they're good marketing tools to reframe this situation. I do agree, of course, Fred, there's no question that some of this, as if nobody knew this was coming, is that clearly these things were predictable and they are moving through. But I do think, as I say, and I just found it so interesting with what Alexei, because I've been thinking about this for a long time. What you see in Russia, these guys are different breed of capitalists. They really are. And I think, by the way, what you're seeing with Donald Trump is a new inception. Absolutely. This is a different kind of thing. It's different, and they are maneuvering and morphing. And by the way, they may move out of capitalism with a different kind of system faster than we can even come up with something else. And we have to be ready to counter it. I really think it's a valuable to do it that way.
I just want to quickly.
Yeah, please.
I just want to, in terms of this, and whether capitalism, to what extent capitalism has changed, and to what extent it remains the system that Marx analyzed. Just call people's attention to the short summary I put up of the conversation between Nancy Fraser and David Harvey on earlier this week, and I hope. It was promised that the whole video of that session is going to be online, and I really recommend that people watch it, because it was very rich and very compelling in terms of both Harvey's explication of what Marx was after in explaining in the 3 volumes of Capital, and then in Nancy Fraser's effort to flesh out what surrounds capitalism as a civilization or as an institutional order that it requires but does not take into account or does not value. So as soon as that's online, I'll post a link to it so people can watch the whole thing.
Great. Can I take the floor?
Yeah, by all means, yeah.
Okay, would you turn the camera? Okay.
Oh, wait, you can.
There we go. Okay, I'm going to be very brief, because we need to move on when everyone else has had a chance to and start picking the themes, which is our last item on the agenda, with Dan taking charge. Alexei, I agree with you even more than 99%, and the reason why is this. The difference between being future historians in 2117 and 2 hairy old Marxists who like to argue about points of theory is this. When we're in little political groups arguing about theory, we could end up expelling each other or calling each other running dogs of the imperialists, because what you say that I don't agree with would lead to this, which would lead to that, and so on. Which is why most of us hate the left and leftist groups. On the other hand, as very happy future historians looking backwards, we have the luxury to weigh what were the different elements that contributed to the global emergence of a new society out of the old. And there, I'm with you 100%. Because if you look at what I wrote under caring and sharing, you'll see that cooperatives and all of these things that you're talking about are an important part of my vision as well. And that when we describe the how, and I think you're absolutely right, we have to be inclusive, because I think that farmers' gardens and permaculture and the way that Lola mentioned about how, or no, it was Anna, about how they took over factories and then ran them cooperatively, I won't say collectively. All of these things are living proof and dynamic elements that are already anti-capitalist within the framework of capitalism as a dying world system. And they're what convinces people that we can go forward that way. And my way of looking at it, when capitalism really crashes and the supermarkets are looted and all of the systems are not working, suddenly these personal and local group experiments in self-sufficiency come to the forward and everybody is for them. And so that's how the transition takes place. So my point is this: in future history, it's not a question of either or. It's a question of and. And as I try to do, and I'm trying to set an example, when I wrote my sharing and caring thing, my teacher, who's talking to the graduates that are 17-year-old, said, well, you're going to travel all around the world, and you'll find societies that are totally communist, and they do it a different way, and you'll see if you like it there, maybe that's where you belong. But, I'm talking about where we are right now, and so we have this money, but it isn't really money because you can't accumulate it, and you can't make other people work for you. That's one thing that's not allowed. So let's go forward.
Lola
Some
wants
more
to say
people on
something.
this?
Lola has her hand. Lola.
Oh,
Lola.
okay. Sorry, I just wanted to mention one little thing. Is that I think when we tend to think about capitalism, we often forget what's at the root of it. And I think at the root of it are people. And I think that when, for example, when we say that capitalism will eventually fail when it's broad enough that it has nowhere else to go, I think that it's not the only possibility. I think because when we think that, it's like capitalism is a thing, but at the root of this thing are people. And I think we can mobilize people and not wait until we reach that late and maybe too late stage when it's so broad that the collapse might be fatal. But I think that if we remember that the capitalism is sustained because of people who are maintaining it, and I think that the problem is not when socialists speak and talk about social change and social progress, the problem is not the what they are saying, like it's not the lack of arguments. I think the problem is how they shape it. And I think if we don't, I mean, I'm definitely biased when I say that because I study psychology and I study people all day long. But I think we need to understand people better in order to avoid maybe waiting until capitalism is so broad and maybe waiting until it's too late, maybe. I think for example, we were talking about the basic income earlier. I forgot who mentioned it. And there was a documentary, and they were asking people if you had if people had a basic income, how many, like in percentage, how many people do you think would stop working at all and just wait until they receive the money? And 80% of people said, yeah, people would stop working. But when they asked the people, what would you stop working if you had an income, a basic income? 80% of people said, no, I wouldn't stop working. So we have these misconceptions about what other people do and like what motivates them to work, for example. And people think that, yeah, we're just lazy, and we have these ideas that people wouldn't do anything if they didn't have the money for it. So I think we really need to work on the very basic level of human minds and try to reshape everything. And this interesting debate you were talking about how to frame like a collaboration instead of I don't know what was it, but I think it would be a good idea to either go back to the real definitions of words, but it might be a very challenging work because, like, for example, when people think about communism, they're afraid that they associate it with what happened in Russia, etc. So I think I agree, either creating new words that are not associated with such bad meanings, or trying to go back to the real meanings of words that have been misused in history, but that may be harder. That's just what I wanted to say.
Yay, good work.
Who's next?
That's it. Should we move on to, let's move, there's a
No,
good
no
place to
one
move
else
on to
wants
our
to do
classes, I think.
Okay, very good.
Fred, can we get up on the screen, I guess, what the next group is? So I believe, let's start, we're going to try to at least get some of the, we're running out of time here. So we're going to try to get at least a couple of the next couple of sessions put together with groups that are then going to lead the presentations, and then hopefully also are going to begin to collectively become the keepers of this particular topic. And so that as we move forward with this process, and we're really hoping that this is going to be something that goes on for years, so that this group will grow and that this group will continue to try to tend to this topic, and as it expands, it can certainly break off and do that. I don't know if you can, we're about to, this is good, he's not getting through, so got a fire engine here trying to force the traffic. So let's try to get a couple of people. I believe the next one is, this says women. Internationalism is the next, is that right?
Yeah, internationalism
is next week. I mean, we can invert them, I suppose.
November 12th.
Right, so next week is internationalism. And I don't know if we have a description of it, but internationalism, as I understand it, and Richard, that's his work. Oh, there are, right. Was any solution to the ecological, financial, just lost it. I can't read it, I can't see it. The other global, was any solution, you're blowing by it. No.
Okay,
all right, scroll up a bit, thank you. Was any solution to the ecological, financial, and other global crises possible, other than a planetary one? Was a better world possible within the world state systems of 2017? The state is a locus of war and organized class repression versus government, which may be democratic. I'm sorry, my eyes are precipitative and useful. Let me get closer so I can read it. History. There we go. There we go. I think I'm loud enough. History of the lever of international solidarity, rise and fall of past workers international. Globally, planetary strikes, boycotts, demonstrations, rising, planetary flash mobs organized through the internet and social media. World Labor Federation, World Women's Organizations, human rights leagues. How did the democratic self-organization of the world economy develop out of these social movements? Assuming the victory of significant reforms and/or the flourishing of alternative societies in one or more localities, how did they contribute to the resolution of the world crises, e.g. as examples or starting points? Reform movements and world revolution, alternatives to the world state system, regionalism, federalism, etc. The internet as a platform for international decision-making and economic coordination, etc. It's a big one, but I think it dovetails into some of the things just out of the gate without putting pressure on anybody. I would love, Lola, if you would participate on this panel. I think that a lot of what you said today is about that, and that to some degree this topic is, again, it is about trying to reframe this, to garner support, to create a new, a new grassroots on this thing. And then I guess we would like to be able to, to at least speculate about some examples. So I would certainly work on this one as well. And maybe Lola, if you would participate in it, and maybe you, Dickie, what do you think?
In 25 words or less. Is this, do we also get, because I saw the next one, which is violence
You can
and
be on all of them.
non-violence.
You can be on as
I
many
would
as you
love, I mean, I know less about systems than I know about.
Go for it.
I love, I would love to do
I'll
violence
join
and
you on
non-violence.
internationalism.
Okay, so
And
Fred,
I'd like to nominate Alexei for internationalism.
does that work for you? He's nodding his head. Okay,
All right, so add his name. Who's got the typewriter here?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Lola, will that work for you?
So which one did you say?
The very first one, internationalism.
internationalism.
And you can participate in others, but I actually thought, as I say, that this one is a little bit about what you've been talking about. Is how do we get the ball? Just to keep it moving, we'll get offline, we'll send out an email, and maybe the group, which is Fred, Alexa, can have a teleconference sometime this week.
I'm an international.
And Richard, well, Richard, it's understood that you're.
Well, let Lola choose then. We have enough people for internationalism. Let Lola choose what she wants to do.
I was thinking about studying on the women topic, but I can, I don't know, whatever. It gives me also more time to prepare because I'm very busy with school. It gives me more time, but I don't know. Can you hear me?
Fred and Richard.
That's fine.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't hear what.
Again, all of you should understand, you can, not only can you be on more than one, but if you're not on more than one, we're gonna run out of people right now. Because the next one is women. And if we assume that all of our women, and Richard.
No. I have
going
a report. The phone just rang and I took the call because I'm waiting to hear from Silvia Federici. And to pick the day we'll do the women discussion because she's not easy to get a hold of. And it's going to be on Sunday, December 10th.
Okay, so that's a ways off.
So Lola has already volunteered. Jenny has already volunteered. The 10th of December.
Yeah.
So I think we've got a good group, and I'm always there as backup in the sense of.
Oh, sure, of course. And I also will participate like that level.
Okay. And just one more remark. You don't have to be on the team to write papers or to contribute articles. It's just that somebody's got to be responsible, but at least a week, if not 2 weeks in advance, you know, the discussion is being planned. Because basically, a friend and I have been running around like dogs chasing their tails, and we're always a few days behind. So that, as I said, Fred posted last night at 11 o'clock something that we're supposed to read.
Sam was leaving. Does he want to participate in any team?
Well, we'll get. All right, let's get to the second one at least, because what just happened here, folks, which is okay, is our second session that I figured we had a lock on scheduling, has now been moved to the back end of this class, which means we have to find a second topic.
Yeah, no, those are the topics that.
No, I know, but the schedule just shifted. I have it.
No, the 19th is violence. No.
All right, the 10th of December for women.
Right, so that was it. So now
the 12th of November for internationalism.
Right.
We're going to run right into that.
Right, so internationalism.
I put it first because I've got tons of stuff, so I know.
Yeah. No, I got it. So now we want to maybe violence. Dickie, you're sort of excited about the violence?
Yeah.
I know, who doesn't blame you? Yeah, exactly. So why don't we move that into the slot that was for women? So we'll do international next week, and then the week after that, we'll do violence. We've got Dickie to be on that. I'll work with him on that, and Richard, obviously, as well.
Work, I was encouraging Barry in the chat to take on the work portion, the session on work.
Okay.
Labor and the future of work, because he was talking about platform capitalism and universal basic income, all those issues. So we will approach him first.
Yeah.
I spoke to Barry on the telephone, and he expressed interest in non-violence.
Okay.
So let's put him on.
No. This is a violence group. We only want.
I'll give you a shot in the face.
Isn't that group of schools? Isn't that what group of schools is?
I don't know. It's violence, not violence.
No, I'm kidding. All right. So good. So that we'll work on that one too. If we have Dickie and you say Sam? Or
No,
Barry?
no, Barry.
Barry. Dickie and Barry.
Give him a question mark so that he.
Right, okay. Is not bad.
We're not gonna start.
Yeah, no, and that's at least the next 2 weeks.
All right,
Plus
no,
the
let's fill them up so they can start.
Well, we're missing some of our bodies though now.
Well, they can add their names later.
Well, the only thing is that we could add their names now.
November 9th.
Well,
You know, that's what I like. You know, I can tell nobody likes that method, but that's actually, I am actually.
Oh, I see.
They asked for it.
Exactly,
They asked
you know.
Excuse me, the only one left that we haven't discussed is the organization.
I volunteered for that already.
And,
Right. I also work on that, and I once again would encourage Lola because it sounds like,
You spell?
yeah, of course, I'll participate on all of them to some degree.
I want to be on what do you call it, organization.
Right, yes.
Is it backpack?
Well, no, it's a,
No, I have stuff that I need to
Okay.
contribute.
I'll be the backup. I'm the backup guy.
It's been the thing that I've been working on most for the last 2 years.
All right, so why don't I'll put it together, we'll talk it through, make sure we've got it settled
So
out.
have we got teams for each of these?
Oh, labor and future work.
we have the beginnings of team.
We'll ask Sam, right? On labor and future work, right? Okay.
And people can go, you don't have to choose
Okay.
one they want.
No, we should hope that you do. Yeah. And again, just for the people that are here, because this is actually, I think, is somewhat the core group of active people. The idea of this is less. Yeah, no, we have other people. Is less to do with trying to, force everybody to come up with stuff, and more to do with the beginnings of setting up more of a committee situation, that these are topics that are going to be permeating this project for as long as we're doing it. And so, and you can join in and you can move around, but the idea is for these groups to begin to circle their wagons around these topics, expand on these topics, bring in new bodies that want to have interest in it. Sometimes people will come in, do a presentation and not, participate fully, bring in new people to participate fully, and begin to set up, nodes was the word that Richard was using, which I kind of like as well, pods or committees or however you want to look at it. But so that way we're really pushing forward on this type of stuff. And again, that it's a living, breathing thing, that it's a never changing and growing. And this is really the very earliest of steps. And that the presentation part of it, which is going to push us through to the end of this semester of classes, is really a mechanism, at least in my mind, is a mechanism in bringing the groups together to begin the starting points of then being able to really grow these groups in meaningful ways so that we can impact the future. I like to think of it, somebody said, we're planting the seeds for the future with these groups. And I think that's right. Nora. And look at that, we can even end on time. That'll be a first.
What time is it?
It is,
5 to 1.
yeah, 5 to 1. You got 5 minutes if you want to say something pithy. To wrap
Oh,
up.
I thought we were going to still do some more brainstorming.
Well, let's do it. We've got 5 minutes. Let's do it.
Let's go. Let's go.
Go ahead, you're in it. You got it. You have the bottle cap.
Well, I already put my one up there and about caring and sharing.
I love
And it includes the basic minimum income. So we can build around what I wrote there. The whole point of the wiki is that we fit everything in. There's a place for everything. So if you, for instance, what I didn't write about, because it's not my field really, is some kind of totally communist society, which we'll say was established in one area or another of the post-capitalist world. So I would love it. Maybe David would like to write something like that, or whoever has more of a traditional idea, less anarchistic than mine.
So throw in one idea, and then we'll.
Oh, well, I
threw out an idea.
I threw out a lot of ideas, including free ice cream.
So a communist society, right?
Well, what I presented in mine was 2 ideas. One is that there are different types of non-capitalist, post-capitalist societies based on people's traditions and on people's ideas and on people's temperaments. And that the youth that my teacher is saying, you're going to go out in the world and travel all around the world, and you may find a system that you're more comfortable in and that you like better.
Okay, so what would it look like? For example, we're a little community, or kind of maybe like an indigenous community, and we have land that is common to all, but everyone has their little piece that they can work on and produce for themselves.
That sounds great. Go on.
Okay, next.
I don't disagree. I agree. I mean, I'm in favor of what I incorrectly called collectivism, of cooperatives. I mean, I sort of see that as the end result, especially in the US, as businesses consolidate and become more monolithic and take over industry. The only way for the independent or the small person to be able to afford anything is through a cooperative. I just don't see, once we get to Amazon delivering food and that's the only source of our food, what happens, right?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that is interesting to me, and I'm thinking about quite a bit, is what Richard is saying about different communities sort of developing differently. And that's a big project. I may have said this at some point when I was introducing myself, is I do a lot of work in the Caribbean, and I spent a decent bit of time there and have some familiarity with at least a couple of the islands and how they run and whatever. And those places seem to me to be contained in a way that might enable something like that. These are smaller communities. They have much less noise, if you will, much less they're obviously being impacted by U.S. and European business interests, but they nevertheless are smaller. They're actually remarkably homogenous, that they do not have, enormous diversity of populations. They're, largely, you got the islanders and that's who's there. And although there's some, you have a much better chance of pulling it out. I would actually think that it's an interesting, sort of fascinating contrast would be look at small European countries, that some of those places also have kind of homogenous populations, easier to consensus build. At some point, very early on, I don't remember, somebody here was talking about Montpelier, Vermont, and it really resonated with me. This small area where suddenly the locals had, decided that they were going to take this into their own hands and did have the ability to impact the school board and therefore the state
Brian report on that because he lives there.
Yeah, that I thought was an interesting idea, and I think that maybe that might be a very realistic permutation of how something might materialize. That smaller areas, remarkably enough, are able to wall themselves up, if you will, much easier than it's ever going to happen here in New York City.
So I haven't had a chance to read Lola's manuscript yet, but I think this is something that's right in her ballpark or area. So I'm just curious if Lola, you could give us like just a 1 minute picture of what the societies look like in your fictional account.
Of course. So in my book, this utopian society, first of all, I imagine it without money. Money doesn't exist because I think that everyone, we are interdependent. No one can exist on his or her own. So I think that people just want to participate in society just because they need and just because they want to participate. Because I think people genuinely want to contribute to a society that they belong in, but also they know that if they contribute in a certain way, others will contribute as well, and that we just rely on the fact that we all need one another. And money, in that sense, I don't need to earn money just to give it to someone else, because I know that what I'm contributing is indirectly contributing to everyone else, and everyone else is contributing to my own survival and well-being. So there's no money in the society I imagined, and also because I think that, as Richard, you mentioned in your paper, that effort could be the mean of evaluating how much money people would earn, but I think it's too subjective, and because like effort can mean different things to different people, and for the same task it wouldn't be the same effort for a young man of 20 years old and another man of 50 years old. So I think for the same task, effort wouldn't be the best criteria, because it depends on what people want and how strong they are and other things. So I prefer to eliminate money entirely. And in my society, also in society, I imagine the young people would go to school to learn about different things, different topics, but also they would alternate between going to school and working, like, so to speak, contributing to the society in different things, so that they can experiment and try to find what fits best for their interest, and then contribute in the way that they feel most motivated, like, to do so. And as for the jobs that like no one wants to do, there would be like some kind of like schedule, and everyone would need to do them at some point, so that it doesn't always go back to the same people doing the jobs that no one wants to do. So that's pretty much what I imagined. I mean, there are some details, but that's the basic idea, I think.
Take us out.
My turn?
Yep, you're.
Yeah, we're wrapping this up.
Okay, well, was that, no, I'm next.
Oh,
I studied law.
What, was on you off?
I studied law.
Oh, you
Well,
said-
I can, what about robots? Won't we have robots who will do the shitty jobs?
Right, robots to do shitty jobs.
That's my society. We'll work on development of robots.
I want to sign off.
Until we decide if they want to do it.
I want to sign off with two, put me on the camera, please.
you're on the camera. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
You're just
All right. Two shitty jobs, the problem is solved in two ways. One by William Morris in his wonderful News from Nowhere, the dustman or garbage man, as we Americans say, was dressed in a kind of Renaissance costume of beautiful colors and so on, and was honored by everybody. That's the way that he projected that. And the great utopian socialist, Charles Fourier, in 1810 or something, to say, well, he said everybody should do what they want, like Olga was, Lola was saying. He said, well, who would pick up garbage? And he said, little boys. Little boys love garbage. And that is absolutely true. When I was about 10 or 12, we used to go with my cousin Tony and his cousin Charles and go to those great mounds of garbage outside of Providence, Rhode Island, to find things. That was our great adventure. So there's room for everybody. And as I say, I took a lot from Lola's society about the children helping and doing things while at the same time learning. So the great thing about future historians is that there's room for everybody, there's room for different types of societies, and that all of the progressive things that we see of elements fighting capitalism become part of the story of how we get from the crisis of 2017 to a viable world in 2117. So does that wrap it up? Are we all for it?
We're all for it.
Okay.
Okay.
See you next
Good
week.
job. Bye-bye.